My own daughter stood in that church doorway, pointed her finger in my face, and told me I wasn't welcome at my granddaughter's wedding. 3 hours later, she was on her knees in my kitchen, begging me to come back and save the whole day. What happened in between is the reason I'm sitting here at 76 years old, telling you this story instead of keeping it to myself like I've kept everything else my whole life. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes family loyalty has to run both directions, hit that like button right now and go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what I share next, because I've got more stories where this one came from. And I'd love to know, while you're settling in with your coffee or your evening tea, where in the world you're watching this from tonight. Type it down in the comments. I read every single one, and it warms this old woman's heart more than you'd believe to see how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you how a 76-year-old grandmother ended up getting thrown out of a wedding she paid $41,000 for. My name is Martha. I've been a widow for 11 years now, since my husband Walter passed from a heart attack in our garden, of all places, on a Tuesday morning in April. We were married for 42 years. I raised one daughter, Deborah, and I loved her the way you love something you'd walk through fire for, even when she made that hard. Deborah grew up and married a man who didn't stick around long. I won't waste your time on him because he's not part of this story. What matters is that Deborah raised her daughter, my granddaughter Emily, mostly on her own, and I helped where I could. I babysat. I paid for dance lessons. I paid for a good chunk of Emily's college tuition because Deborah was working 2 jobs and couldn't swing it alone. I never once threw that in anybody's face. I did it because that's what grandmothers do, or at least that's what I always believed. Emily grew up into a beautiful young woman, kind-hearted, hard-working, the kind of granddaughter who still called her old grandma just to talk about nothing in particular. When she got engaged to a young man named Nathan, I cried real tears of joy. I liked Nathan. He was steady, he was respectful, and he made Emily laugh in that easy way you can't fake. When wedding planning started, Deborah came to me. Not with a hug, not with a heart-to-heart, but with a spreadsheet. She sat at my kitchen table and told me the wedding was going to cost around $60,000, and she needed help. I didn't hesitate. I wrote a check for $41,000 right then and there. That was most of what Walter and I had saved over a lifetime of scrimping, but I didn't care. It was for Emily. It was for family. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until the day of the wedding itself, was that somewhere along the way I had become inconvenient. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, or maybe the signs I chose not to see because I didn't want to believe my own daughter was capable of what she eventually did. It started small. Deborah stopped inviting me to the cake tastings. She said it was because I worried too much about cost and it made the planning stressful. Fine, I thought. I let it go. Then I wasn't invited to the dress fitting, the one where Emily tried on her mother's veil altered to fit her. Deborah said it was just a mother-daughter moment, and I told myself that was fair enough even though it stung, because I remembered helping choose that very veil with my own mother decades before. Then came the seating chart discussions, which I only heard about secondhand from my sister, who was wrong. Something had changed. I just didn't know what yet. 2 weeks before the wedding, I found out through a cousin, not through Deborah, not through Emily, through a cousin who assumed I already knew, that there was a new woman in the picture. Nathan's stepmother, a woman named Corinne, had come into a good deal of money recently after a divorce settlement, and she had started offering to help with wedding costs extra. Corinne wanted flowers upgraded, a better photographer, a live band instead of the DJ I'd already paid a deposit for. And somewhere in those conversations, apparently, Deborah decided that Corinne's money made Corinne more important than mine. Corinne got invited to the tastings. Corinne got invited to the fittings. Corinne got a seat at the head table. I still didn't say a word. I told myself, let it go, Martha. This day isn't about you. It's about Emily. I would show up, I would smile, I would watch my granddaughter get married, and that would be enough. I was wrong about that too. The morning of the wedding, I got up at 5, curled my hair the way I always do for special occasions, put on the pale blue dress I'd bought specifically for the day, and drove myself the 40 minutes to the venue because nobody had thought to arrange a ride for me, even though I'd mentioned my eyesight isn't what it used to be for highway driving after dark. I arrived 2 hours early the way I always do because I like to help set things up. Instead, I found the venue already buzzing with people I barely recognized, all fussing over floral arrangements that Corinne had apparently paid extra to have flown in from somewhere fancy. Nobody greeted me at the door. I stood there a moment in my pale blue dress, feeling like a stranger at my own granddaughter's wedding. I found Deborah near the bridal suite, and before I could even say good morning, she turned to me with a look on her face I will never forget as long as I live. Cold, impatient, almost embarrassed to see me. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk." She pulled me into a side hallway, away from the guests starting to trickle in, and she told me, flat out, no cushioning, no gentleness, that she thought it would be less complicated if I didn't attend the ceremony. She said Corinne and her family were sensitive about old tensions in blended families, and that having me there might create an awkward dynamic given some comment I'd apparently made months earlier about Corinne's involvement, a comment I don't even remember making, and which certainly wasn't meant with any malice. I stood there, 76 years old, in my pale blue dress, and listened to my only daughter tell me I wasn't welcome at the wedding I had paid $41,000 to make possible. I asked her quietly if Emily knew about this. Deborah's eyes flicked away from mine just for a second, and that told me everything. Emily didn't know. This wasn't Emily's decision. This was Deborah choosing Corinne's comfort over her own mother's presence at a wedding I had helped build from the ground up. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not there anyway. I have never once in my life made a scene, and I wasn't about to start at my own granddaughter's wedding. I simply nodded, turned around, walked back out to my car in the gravel parking lot, and drove myself home in that pale blue dress with tears finally streaming down my face once I was safely out of sight of anyone who might see an old woman falling apart behind the wheel. Here's the thing about being 76 years old and having run a household, raised a child, buried a husband, and managed every dollar that ever came through my hands. You learn to plan ahead. You learn that trust is a thing you extend, but you never extend it blindly, not even to your own daughter. When I wrote that $41,000 check months earlier, I hadn't handed it directly to the venue or the vendors. Deborah had asked me to put the funds into a joint account she'd set up for wedding expenses, so that she could manage the vendor payments as they came due, a little at a time, since some vendors wanted deposits and others wanted payment closer to the date. I'd agreed to that arrangement because it seemed practical, and because foolishly I trusted her completely. What Deborah didn't know, because I never mentioned it, and because I am, if nothing else, a careful woman, was that I was also listed as a co-signer on that account with full authority to move funds, because the bank required a second name given the size of the deposit. Deborah had breezed past that detail during setup, more focused on getting the account open than on reading the fine print. I had read every line. So while several vendors, the caterer, the florist doing the extra arrangements Corinne had requested, and the string quartet Corinne had insisted on adding on top of the DJ I'd already paid, were scheduled to receive their final payments that very afternoon, several hours before the reception, I sat down at my kitchen table, still in my pale blue dress, dried my eyes, and I made a decision. I called the bank. I didn't drain the account out of spite in some reckless fit. I want to be honest with you about that because I'm not proud of acting rashly, and I didn't. What I did was place a hold on the outstanding scheduled payments that hadn't yet cleared. The caterer's final balance, the extra floral order, and the string quartet's fee funds that, legally and financially, were still mine to control until they left the account. I left everything already paid for completely untouched. The venue was paid. The dress was paid. The photographer, the cake, the DJ I'd originally booked. All of it was already settled and safe. I simply stopped the new, extra spending that Corinne had piled on top of my original gift, the spending that had somehow made me disposable in my own daughter's eyes. Then I sat back and I waited. It didn't take long. About 2 hours before the reception was set to begin, my phone rang. It was Deborah, and I could hear the panic in her voice before she even finished saying Mom. The caterer had called her, confused, saying the final payment hadn't gone through and they couldn't guarantee service without it. The florist doing Corinne's extra arrangements said the same. The string quartet's manager left a message saying they wouldn't perform without confirmed payment, effective immediately. Deborah was frantic. She asked me if I knew anything about it. I told her the truth. I told her that I was the co-signer on that account, that I had simply chosen not to release funds for additions to a wedding I'd apparently been uninvited from, and that everything I had originally agreed to pay for remained exactly as promised. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Mom, she said finally, her voice cracking, please. Emily doesn't know any of this. She's going to be devastated if the reception falls apart. Please, can you fix this? I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, some kind of sweet satisfaction. Mostly what I felt was tired. Tired of being an afterthought. Tired of being useful only when I was needed and invisible the rest of the time. I told her calmly that I would consider helping, but only under one condition. I wanted to come to the wedding. Not sneak in through a side door. Not sit quietly out of sight so Corinne's family wouldn't feel awkward. I wanted a seat, a real seat at my granddaughter's wedding in full view as her grandmother, exactly as I should have had all along. Deborah didn't argue. She didn't have the room to argue. Not with vendors threatening to walk and a reception starting in under 2 hours. She said yes. She said she'd handle it, whatever that meant to her in the moment. An hour later, my doorbell rang. Deborah was standing on my porch, still in her mother of the bride dress. Mascara streaked down her face from crying in the car. And there, 76 years old, in my kitchen where she used to sit as a little girl doing her homework, my daughter got down and genuinely begged me to come back, to forgive her, to please just come save her daughter's wedding day. I could have made her suffer longer. Some of you watching might think I should have. But I am not a woman who holds a grudge for the pure pleasure of holding it. I held it just long enough to be heard, and then I let it go because in the end this was never really about punishing Deborah. It was about being seen. I called the bank back and released the payments myself, standing right there in front of Deborah so she'd understand exactly what had happened and exactly why. I told her plainly that I loved Emily too much to let a grudge ruin her wedding day, but that I would never again allow myself to be treated as a checkbook instead of a grandmother. I changed out of my house clothes, put my pale blue dress back on, fixed my hair one more time, and Deborah drove me back to the venue herself. When I walked in, Emily saw me from across the room and her face lit up in a way that told me she truly had no idea what her mother had done. She ran over, threw her arms around me, and told me she was so glad I'd made it after all, that she'd been confused earlier when someone told her I'd had car trouble. I never corrected that story in front of her, not that day. That day belonged to Emily, not to old family wounds. I sat in a real chair at a real table, and I watched my granddaughter marry a good man. And I cried the happy kind of tears this time. The conversation with Deborah came later, a few weeks after the wedding, over coffee at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd once knelt and begged. I told her plainly that what she did that morning was one of the most hurtful things anyone in my family had ever done to me. And that, money aside, what stung the most wasn't being uninvited. It was realizing that somewhere along the way, my own daughter had decided I was easier to discard than to defend. Deborah cried. She apologized, and I believe, for what it's worth, that the apology was genuine. She told me she'd let herself get caught up trying to please people who didn't matter nearly as much as the people who'd always shown up for her. We're rebuilding things slowly. It isn't perfect. But she knows now, in a way she didn't before, that respect isn't something you can turn on and off depending on who's in the room. As for Corinne, I never said an unkind word to her. Not once, not that day and not since. She wasn't the one who owed me anything. That debt belonged to my daughter, and my daughter alone. I'm 76 years old. I've buried a husband, raised a daughter mostly by myself in the hard years, and I've learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just permission for people to walk over you. I gave everything I had to that wedding, financially and otherwise, and for a few hours on the worst morning of that year, I let myself be pushed aside like I didn't matter. But I mattered enough to write that check, and I decided that day I would matter enough to be treated like family too, or I wouldn't be treated like a bank. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the grandmother, the mother, the quiet one who gives and finally decided enough was enough, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me if you've ever had to draw a line with someone you loved. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like mine, because at 76, I've got plenty left to tell. And I'm not finished yet.